We are continuing our month of June sermon series this morning on the book of Jonah. When we left off last week, Jonah, you will recall, had just been thrown into the waters of the sea, and what happened next? He was swallowed by the big fish. So we pick up the story today in chapter 2 with Jonah in the fish. You are invited to follow along, Jonah 2, verses 1 through 10. You can read that on page 752 of your pew Bibles if you so desire. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have a word that I would like for you to consider and think about throughout this sermon today. The word is disgusting. Disgusting. What do you find disgusting? No need to shout it out. Please do not share it with your neighbor. Just consider the question as we get going today. About a year and a half ago, an article appeared in the New York Times entitled, How Disgust Explains Everything. In the article, Molly Young writes, the more you read about the history of disgust, the more convinced you might be that disgust is the energy powering a whole host of seemingly unrelated phenomena. From our never-ending culture wars to the existence of kosher laws, it's a bodily experience that creeps into every corner of our social lives. A piece of evolutionary hardware, she writes, designed to protect our stomachs that expanded into a system for protecting our souls. Of course, disgust has always been a part of us, right? I've read that there are 6 basic emotions within each of us. There's anger, sadness, fear, joy, surprise, and disgust. But the triggers for what disgusts one person at one time or in one day, they can be very different from what disgusts someone else at another time and day. In his 19th century work, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, Charles Darwin described an encounter that took place in Tierra del Fuego. Darwin was at his campsite, and he was eating some meat. It was cold meat, preserved meat. As he was eating, one of the natives came over to Darwin, poked the meat with his finger, showing, Darwin wrote, utter disgust at the meat's softness. Darwin responded with his own feeling of disgust. He was grossed out that this stranger had just stuck his finger in his food. Now, it's easy enough for Charles Darwin to understand why this stranger was disgusted by his food. The man had never seen meat look like that before, cold and soft and mushy. But Darwin could not quite figure out why he was repulsed by what that stranger did. Was it because the man was from another culture, a foreigner, nearly naked when he came over to him. Neither the man nor his finger looked dirty. Why was Darwin disgusted? Have you ever thought about what disgusts you? Consider that question as we explore today's text from Jonah. Our text from Jonah is the 2nd chapter. Jonah has just been swallowed by that big fish, and what does Jonah do? Inside the belly of the giant fish, Jonah offers a prayer. It sounds at first blush like a very pious prayer, a prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer of praise to God for saving Jonah from the storm and from the sea. But take another look at what Jonah actually says in the prayer. Some biblical scholars argue that Jonah's prayer from the belly of the fish is not as honest as it appears, that it is, in fact, a very hypocritical prayer. For example, in his prayer, Jonah says the following: "As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you in your holy temple." Jonah speaks as if he'd forgotten about God. But is that what happened back in chapter 1? Did Jonah forget about God in chapter 1? No. Jonah spent the first chapter trying to escape from God. God is all that is on Jonah's mind. He just doesn't do what God asked him to do. He's not forgetting the Lord, he's fleeing the Lord. Or take a look at verse 4 in our text. "Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple?" Except Jonah was not driven away, he ran away. And how shall I look again upon your holy temple? Why is Jonah talking about the holy temple? That's in Jerusalem. Where did God want Jonah to go? Do you remember? Nineveh. That's right, Nineveh, not to Jerusalem. Do you see what's going on here? Jonah's prayer appears to be a holy petition to God, but really, it's painting a much different picture than what actually happened. After all, Jonah ran from God, disobeyed God, and after he's thrown into the sea, it is God who saves Jonah with the fish. Where is Jonah's repentance? Where is Jonah's remorse? Where in this prayer does Jonah say, "God, I'm so sorry, I made a big mistake"? This is why some scholars treat Jonah's prayer not as a heartfelt prayer of contrition and humility, but as a prayer of false piety. So, in response to this prayer, which ends with verse 9, do you recall what happens in verse 10? Verse 10 goes like this: "Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land." That's a tame way to put it. In response to Jonah's prayer, the fish puked. It found, or God found, Jonah's prayer to be disgusting. Have you thought about what you find disgusting? I debated whether or not to do a hand raise here. I won't do it. Let's take a silent poll. How many of you know the 3-second rule? The 3-second rule. You know about that, right? If a piece of food falls off your plate or off the counter at your home and is on the floor for 3 seconds or less, how many of you would pick it up and eat it if you were having dinner with your family? Well, good. Some hands are in the air. All right. How many of you would eat it if nobody else was around? A couple more hands shot up. How many of you would never eat it once it touches the floor? No hands are in the air. That's right, silent poll. It's a silly example, I know. When it comes to the 3-second rule, I'm not sure that disagreement over what's disgusting matters very much. But when it comes to church, when it comes to extending hospitality in God's church. Disagreement over what's disgusting matters a great deal. For example, our first text today is the call of Matthew. You heard it a few minutes ago. What kind of life did Matthew lead? Matthew was a tax collector, someone that his neighbors would have looked at and said, "The way you make your living is abhorrent. Taking money from your own people, giving it to the Roman people, while you take some for yourself along the way, that's repulsive. That's disgusting." But none of that stopped Jesus. Jesus waded right into those waters of disgust and called Matthew to be his disciple. And when he had dinner with Matthew and his fellow tax collectors, it was not the food that they were eating that the Pharisees found repulsive. It was who Jesus was eating with. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Do you see the issue here? It's the same issue that Jonah raised all those years before. What does it mean to welcome everyone, absolutely everyone, no exceptions, as the child of God that they are? Jonah did not want God to extend God's grace and welcome to the Ninevites. He found that disgusting. The Pharisees did not want Jesus to eat with tax collectors and sinners. They thought that was disgusting. All of which makes me wonder, have you ever been in your life in the position of welcoming someone, extending God's grace to someone, and somebody else criticized you for it? Somebody else found your hospitality disgusting. There's a famous episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that first aired back in 1969. In the episode, Francois Clemens, who was the first black actor to appear as a regular on a children's television show, he played the policeman on Mr. Rogers' show. Fred Rogers first met him when they were in church together, and Fred Rogers heard Francois Clemens singing, and singing very beautifully. So he invited Mr. Clemens to be on his show, and in this particular episode, after a long day at work, Officer Clemens comes by the house of his friend, Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers is soaking his bare feet in a small pool of water, and he invites Officer Clemens to do the same. So he does, and they soak their feet together in the pool. And Mr. Rogers then takes a towel and dries off the feet of Officer Clemens. It's a famous episode now because of how groundbreaking it was back then. After all, back then, a pool was not just a pool. This was 1969. The same year that the Supreme Court declared segregation in public pools to be unconstitutional. And here's a popular television show for children in which a white person and a black person are, in essence, sharing the same pool. I wonder if Francois Clemens or Fred Rogers ever received, a letter after that show aired criticizing them for what they did. I have no idea. But it would not surprise me if that happened. Because here is the thing about the radical hospitality and grace of God's kingdom. It gets criticized. Not everyone likes it, right? Jonah didn't like it. He makes that very clear in the last chapter of this book. How many of you took me up on my advice last week and went home and read the book of Jonah last Sunday? Show of hands. Okay, yeah, good. A few of you, right. If you get to chapter 4 in this book, God extends God's grace to the Ninevites, and does Jonah celebrate his great success as a prophet of God? No. He gets angry at God. How could you offer grace to these people? The hospitality and grace and welcome of God is never a neutral subject. In the Bible, it's a controversial subject, all of which makes me wonder, have you ever been part of a church that extended God's grace to someone or to a group of people, and your church was criticized for welcoming those people? Years ago, the late pastor Ernest Campbell was serving a church in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was 1963. JFK had just been assassinated, and a member of Campbell's church gave him a call. This member suggested that one thing they might be able to do to partially redeem the tragedy would be to provide Marina Oswald, the widow of Lee Harvey Oswald, with an opportunity to improve her English. She had expressed this wish and wanted to stay in the United States. The church made its plans, and in due time, while a battery of reporters waited hawkishly at the airport, Marina Oswald slipped into the community at night by train. She lived undercover with a family in the congregation until the church was finally forced to issue a press release. Then the mail started coming in. Some were quick and hot to say that the church's actions were unpatriotic. Others said that the move was not wise. Others that it was unfair. One woman wrote that she had belonged to that church for 40 years, and everything that church had done for her could fit on the back of a postage stamp. Others simply said it was grossly un-American. The Reverend Campbell answered every single letter. No one was ignored. But what he said to each person who criticized their church was this: the one thing you have not shown us is that what we have done was unlike Christ. What do you find disgusting? That's not just an emotional question or a food question or an anthropological question. It is a faith question. It has something to do with who we welcome, how we welcome them when it comes to being God's church. You see, we've been talking this past year about the vision and pillars of Westminster. They're right there in the insert to your bulletin once again today. And the number one pillar of this church is what? Oh boy, okay, all right. Number one pillar of it, you can cheat and look. Hospitality, good, I heard it. Hospitality, number one pillar. It is one of this congregation's strengths. In fact, I just learned a few weeks ago about a fascinating statistic within our denomination. The vast majority of churches in our denomination are not growing. That's not what's fascinating. Westminster is growing. In fact, if you look at PC USA congregations that have 400 members or more, between the years of 2006 and 2021, a 15-year period, and you look at those churches of 400 members or more in our denomination, and you calculate the rate of growth for every church in that 15-year period of time, do you know what Westminster's rate of growth was during those 15 years? 27%. Do you know where that ranks in our denomination? Number one. Number one. During that 15-year period, no PC USA church grew at a higher rate. It means that when it comes to hospitality, when it comes to welcoming people, y'all are doing something right. Open minds, open hearts. So I got to wondering, what would it look like, not just to be number one in terms of growth, many people coming through our doors, what would it look like if at some point we got criticized because of who was coming through our doors? You see, as far as I can tell, Jesus was always being criticized for the kind of people he welcomed and who he brought into his fold. And one of the messages of the book of Jonah is that everyone belongs in God's fold. If the pastors of this church and the session of this church started getting emails criticizing us because of who we were welcoming and how we were doing it, how would you feel about that? Would you feel that we were headed in the wrong direction? Or would you feel like we were following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ?